Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about actually migrating from on-premises or another cloud to Azure. It's the topic that most people are asking for at the moment that I've not already created a video about. And as always, if this is useful, please go ahead and give this video a like, comment, and subscribe and share. So if I think about migrating to Azure, we have to first really think about, well, what do we have today? So today on premises, we probably have virtual machines. So I have a whole bunch of virtual machines, maybe some physical. So I have some bare metal installations, but most of what we have are virtual machines. Maybe you have some containers. Now within those virtual machines, you run workloads. Maybe I have, for example, application workloads. Maybe I'm running some databases. Maybe I'm running some infrastructure services, maybe things like domain controllers. I might have things like websites. Maybe I've even got kind of a VDI environment. You get the idea. So you have all these different workloads running in virtual machines. And these just kind of carry on. And now you're thinking, okay, well, I want to take this, be it from on-prem or maybe other clouds, and I want to shift it up to Azure. And the temptation would be, well, I've got these things running in virtual machines. I can run them in virtual machines in Azure. So absolutely, we can think about, well, there's Azure. And up in Azure, there's absolutely the idea that I can have virtual machines. So that is one of the types of service we think about infrastructure as a service, i.e. a virtual machine. And those workloads we have there could absolutely either be migrated or reinstalled into a virtual machine in Azure. But the whole point about the cloud is, so I think about, okay, we've got Azure up here, is there's a lot more. There's services that provide more than just that base IaaS. Now, some of them build on virtual machines. If you think about, well, I had VDI over here, when the cloud, there's kind of that Windows Virtual Desktop. So with Windows Virtual Desktop, as a managed solution, it provides the gateway to encapsulate the RDP over 443. There's the RD Web as that initial entry point. There's a connection broker. And then it uses virtual machines in your subscription on your virtual network. So I can absolutely do that. There's even different types of virtual machines. So sure, there's the Azure virtual machines we're used to, but there's also things like, well, there's the Azure VMware solution. And inside that, I run VMs. But they're managed by vCenter, that familiar environment if you're a VMware shop today. And where that can be super useful is that migration scenario. Hey, I need to get out of my data center as quickly as possible. I really don't have time to take advantage of Azure native constructs. I just need to use the tooling I have. I need to vMotion that stuff as quick as possible. Well, there's the Azure VMware solution up there for that purpose. Then on top of, again, the virtual machines, but now I have multiple instances of workloads, there's things like virtual machine scale sets, building multiple VMs from a base configuration with the ability to auto scale based on, for example, metrics or a schedule. Then there's things like Azure Container Services. So here I'm actually having all the kind of the pods with the containers running inside them. And again, I might have multiple kind of worker nodes in there. There's things like app services. These HTTP-based applications. And then, of course, there's database services. So there's a whole bunch of different database services built on Microsoft SQL Server, so Azure SQL Database, single instance, elastic pool, managed instance deployed into your virtual network, hyperscale, serverless. There's Cosmos DB built for the cloud, supporting all those different types of APIs and models like columnar, key value, graph, kind of document. And then the open source software databases, the Postgres, the MySQL, MariaDB, there are managed versions of those. So there's all these different solutions that are available in Azure. So on-prem, we have virtual machines. I have a hammer, and when I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So absolutely, I could go over to here or to here. And that may be the right solution, but certainly take some time to understand there's different types of target. Because as with everything, if I can try and go more PaaS-like in my solution, it's going to give me benefits. These are things like evergreen solution. There's less for me to manage. So my total cost of ownership will generally decrease. Now, it's easy for me to kind of say that, hey, yes, so there's long-term savings, there's lower total cost of ownership, but obviously there's more work involved. For me to just take a VM and move it to a VM, that's a fairly simple process. As I start to do different types of things to get to, for example, app services or AKS, there's more work to actually achieve that. And so we have to look at a number of different aspects to decide, well, is that really something we want to be doing or not? So in terms of actually, well, okay, I want to move to the cloud, I have to ask myself a number of questions. Well, how long do I have? If I'm in a huge rush, hey, my data center's being decommissioned, I have 3 months to move. I do not have time to modernize and re-architect a whole bunch of apps to move to PaaS. I may have enough time to move to Azure IaaS VMs, maybe not even that, and I want to, if I'm on VMware today, hey, I want to move to the Azure VMware solution. I don't want to reskill, I just need to keep using vCenter, I need to get it out my data center. And then maybe later on, I can do things like actually, well, now I'll move it to more Azure-like services. Is the app strategic? I.e., is it something that's important to the company that I'm going to carry on using for the foreseeable future? Because if it is, then, well, maybe I do want to sort of re-architect and start taking advantage of other types of service. If it's going to be around for 5 years, then spending some money now to modernize it with that reduced total cost of ownership will actually be worth it to me as an organization. Which really brings me on to, is there kind of a total cost of ownership time limit? i.e., I'm willing to spend money, but I have to get that money back within a year or within 2 years. So yes, I'll spend some money to take advantage of other types of service, but I want that return on investment super fast. So what is my kind of return on investment tolerance, so to speak, to actually, sure, I'll spend 100 grand, I want to save that 100 grand in the next 2 years. If it's going to take me longer than 2 years to get that 100 grand investment back, I'm not prepared to do it. So that can really come out as a driving factor. What is my budget? I mean, there's limited amounts of funds. So how much can I actually spend as part of the migration? There might be, yes, time to get things back, and maybe I can make arguments to get additional budget if I can show, hey, there's going to be these savings over a period of time. But there's still a finite bucket of money. There's still a finite time. And also, I mean, there's this overriding theme you can kind of say is, well, what is the company strategy? If the company's overall strategy is to go PaaS, then that's going to drive me forward in certain directions. But again, I have to answer all these other questions because I can't make time. Sometimes I can make time if I spend more money, but the time, the money I have available, tolerance for return on investment, I need to be able to answer those questions. So before there's anything technical, I have to understand those factors so I can make the right decisions on a per app basis, because we're probably not going to do one thing. I'm not going to, well, everything has to do the same. If it's a VM, it's going to a VM, or it's all going to app service plans. You're going to have different apps with different strategic values, with different lifetimes. And obviously I want to do the right thing based on really how important the application is. Now I've said a few different words. I've said re-architect, rehost, refactor. So what do all those mean? So I drew this direction. Hey, we're just going that way. But there's actually different options we have, and you'll often hear people kind of talk about these 5 R's of migration. Because if I think about it, my actual options are, well, sure, I can rehost. So rehost is literally a lift and shift. I'm going to take that virtual machine and put that virtual machine there. It may actually be migrating it, actually somehow maybe at the hypervisor, maybe saying in guest, replicating it to a VM in Azure. Maybe it's just reinstalling the app in a VM in Azure, but I'm in no way changing the architecture. I'm in no way modifying the application code. I'm literally just taking it as is and putting it in the cloud. That's the easiest to do, is the least impact, but I'm not really gaining a huge amount of the overall kind of cloud service add-ons. Then we can think about, we have refactor. So once again, with refactor, I'm not going to change the code. I'm not changing the application code, but I'm willing to maybe do some tweaks to how I host this, if I don't have to change the app code, to start to gain some benefit from cloud services. So this could be something, well, my VM, for example, currently is running a web app. Well, that code could actually run without any changes in an app service plan. It might be, hey, I'm running this database, this SQL Server database, or this Postgres database, or whatever. Well, I could just host it in the Azure database offering, be it Azure SQL Database, or Azure Managed Database for Postgres, or MySQL MariaDB. I can move to those. So this is starting to kind of, well, I'm going to kind of move to some kind of paths, whereas that's just definitely just going to virtual machines. But I'm still, there's no code changes in here. So if I kind of think about this, no code change. I can take it as is. Then we start to get into things like, well, I'm going to re-architect. So with re-architecture, well, now I'm actually willing to make some changes to my application code. This maybe is, well, there's certain aspects of the application. Maybe it's the way the application talks to the database. For example, maybe my app code is fine. The app code I could actually have taken and just run it in a container or run it in app service. But I actually want to switch my database. Maybe, for example, I'm running Oracle today and I'm going to move to Postgres. Well, I have to make some changes to my code. So I'm wanting to do some re-architecture here, but also maybe I'm going to re-architect to now running containers. Maybe I can run serverless. Maybe I can put some stuff into functions. So now I'm actually starting to make some code changes. I'm embracing more of a cloud architecture. I'm willing to re-architect some stuff in my app. Now there might be a certain point where there's so many changes required, it's easier to just rebuild it from scratch. I'm not going to try and tweak this. I'm just going to kind of start again and just rebuild how my application works. Now, obviously, as soon as I get into kind of these re-architect and rebuild, the work is going up. So there's more and more work involved. If I think about where we're going here, up to this point, I can really think about the effort is, that's the wrong way. Let's do it the other way. I can think about the effort is kind of getting bigger. So that's lots, and that's minimal. So as I move down this stack, my work goes up, but I also start to attain more benefit. So I'm really kind of getting more cloud optimized as I go that way. So it's more work, but overall I'm taking more benefit from the cloud. My total cost of ownership will probably decrease because I'm using more of those services. My work, my responsibility lessens. And then there's another option, which is actually just replace. So this might be, do you know what? This service I have, it's actually just available as a SaaS service. Maybe today on premises in these servers I'm running SharePoint. Well, I can just go to Microsoft 365 and use SharePoint online. I don't have to host that thing anymore. So there's always these different factors I have to consider. So I have to answer all of these questions. Remember, there's not a single right answer. I have to answer these questions to decide which of these makes the most sense. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time re-architecting or rebuilding my app if the app is not strategic. If it's going away in 6 months, I'll rehost the thing. I'm going to do the bare minimum. But if it's a strategic app, then hey, I might want to spend, it's going to be around for a long time. Investing money now will, over the next 2 years, return that investment, and then I'm saving money on subsequent years. So I have to answer the questions to really understand what am I willing to do. So that's kind of the key point we think about. Okay, so that's kind of what we want to do. How do we do it? So I can think about, well, I have to understand my current environment. So really the first thing we have to do is discover. I have to know, what do I have today? And there's many dimensions to discover. So yes, what do I have? What servers are out there? What are they running in terms of operating system, in terms of application? What is their hardware configuration? I have to find all the things, know all about them first. But then I have to think about, well, what is the performance of them? And by performance, I'm saying, what is it actually using? On premises, it's very common that we over provision things. We give it more CPUs than it needs because typically we actually over provision the physical hardware. I can have a hypervisor. I can give every VM 4 virtual CPUs, even though there's only 4 cores on the underlying box, but they can share it. Well, that's fine, because I was like, well, I'll give it to them. Gang scheduling of the CPUs with hypervisors is not really a problem anymore. But I don't think it's ever going to use it. But in the cloud, I pay based on the size of the virtual machine. If I give a VM 4 virtual CPUs when it only really needs 2, I'm doubling my cost. So what is the actual performance this thing really does? And then, what are the dependencies? And this is super important. This often gets overlooked. I don't think people fully appreciate the problems this will cause if it's not done correctly. Because you can really think about, well, okay, I have an app today. Great. My app today talks to a database. And they're sitting in the same kind of physical building. And so there's a latency. The latency is the time it takes for the communication. So it's going to be sub-millisecond, typically. Super low. So these can be very chatty. And chatty means they're constantly going back and forth, maybe wastefully, but it doesn't matter. There's a very minimal delay. I could think about if I was in a room with someone and I could only write notes to ask questions. Well, I would write a note, ask a question, slide it over the desk. They would look at the note and they would write an answer on a note and pass the note back to me. So that entire exchange maybe takes a minute. It's fast, so it's not really a problem to just ask a question at a time. So now imagine we took that database and now we moved that database to the cloud. So we actually do that migration. Well, so there was a 1 millisecond latency before. Whether it's express route and it's a 100 gigabit per second, that's just bandwidth. That's just the size of the pipe. The latency is based on distance. And so here, maybe now my latency is 30 milliseconds, kind of round trip. So that's now like that person I was starting the note to is now in a different building. And every time I write a question, I have to put it in an internal envelope and a courier sends it to the other building. They read the question, they write the answer and they send it back. Maybe now it's an hour. So I've gone from a minute to an hour. So imagine if I was that chatty conversation, now what used to take 10 minutes would now take 10 hours. So if these are chatty, well now everything is 30 times that length. Now maybe I can't tolerate that, the app just wouldn't work at all, or I have to change the way I work. If it was me sending the note, I wouldn't write one question anymore at a time. I would write all 6 questions or 10 questions I need answered in one go, send it over. I still get the latency, but I'm only getting the latency once. Then they write all the answers and send it back to me. When this architecture, instead of the app being very chatty, it would bundle up sets of transactions, send them over to get the response so I can handle that latency a bit better. The point is, I have to understand the dependencies, because what I don't want to do is move something to the cloud, leave something behind that's now going to cripple its performance. I don't want to get into this situation without expecting it. I need to know it's coming. So I need to know what are different components actually talk to so I don't get into that situation. Once we know what we have, remember that discovery, remember I also answer all of these questions. I understand the business impact. So maybe I should write that down. Kind of the app value, so to speak, to the business. Once I have that, then I need to do an assessment. So as part of the assess, I'm really trying to understand. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I have my assessment, and this is answering a number of things. I know about the app now. Now I need to work out, well, what can I do with that knowledge? So I could think about, well, firstly, can it move to the cloud? Maybe it can't. Maybe I've discovered it's a certain configuration. Maybe the size, it's this bare metal box and there is just no size big enough in Azure. Maybe it's a mainframe, maybe it's a Unix box, and I just can't move it. There are some things you can't. Now, Azure actually has things like mainframe capabilities now in the cloud you can kind of purchase. But there may be things you just can't move. You may discover because of these dependencies, these things have to all be kept. Maybe sometimes you hear talk of an anchor. It's this thing on-prem, it could be a mainframe, and other things rely on it. So that anchor can't move, so I can't move the things that depend on it. So I have to understand those. So I'm going to assess, well, can it even move to the cloud? That's a question I have to answer. And then we might want to right size it, because maybe it is over provisioned today. So I'm going to take that performance information we got here and feed it in. So I can see, well, hey, yes, you had 4 CPUs, but you never used more than 1. You never use more than this amount of memory. So you don't need that. Now, this obviously highly depends on the quality of the data. i.e., if I only ran that discovery, that capturing for 10 minutes, I may not have caught the right information. So we want to run that discovery so we can see the peaks of the workload. So maybe that's running for a full day. Maybe the seasonality is a week. A month you're probably pushing it. I would have to then make some decisions. I would have to understand my workload. If I'm a company, for example, that has maybe once a year, maybe I'm a tax company, then I'd have to be like, okay, it's suggesting this right sizing, but I know at a certain point, I have to be much bigger than that. Now, maybe I try and use scaling. I try and use those other services so I can still be small and then scale out horizontally when I need to. But the quality of data is going to be key to make sure I've got that right size data. So I think about, well, kind of what is that duration of the capture and make sure I'm handling any kind of seasonality, i.e. daily, weekly, whatever that burst is. So I want to right size the thing. I have to think about, well, grouping. And that comes down into this. I need to maybe move certain things together because they depend on each other. So I want to move those as a single unit so I don't end up leaving half of it behind, because that again would be kind of a bad day. And then I have to think about, what is the target service? I.e. the 5 R's. Because based on the questions I've answered about the app, well, maybe I want to re-architect it. Maybe I'm going to replace it. And you'll probably get into this position where you'll have a whole list of all your applications and you'll basically tag them. Okay, this app's going to be, these apps are rehosting, these are refactoring, these are going to re-architect, these I'm going to rebuild, these are being replaced. So you'll break the apps down into those categories, and then you can work out a schedule to actually perform the migration. So we have the discovery, the assessment, and then we think about, well, actually migrating. And obviously this we have to have a good plan for. So again, based on all that knowledge, how we're doing these, what service, we create a plan, making sure we consider, well, how long is it going to take? If we're doing like a re-architecture, well, it's going to take longer. So then if other things rely on it, well, they have to wait till that's ready. So there's a whole lot of project management is going to come into this process. Is it kind of online migration or is it offline? Obviously this impacts downtime. If I can move something online, it's still running, doing its job. I'm replicating while it's running. VMs can do this, databases can do this, depending on the service we're actually going to use. And that kind of does come into kind of, can I support this kind of, this ongoing replication? Is it going to have to continue for a while? Because I'm going to do testing. As part of this migration, I do the plan, and that plan will include things like, well, a test migration, which requires test networks, and then we'll actually do the actual migration. I was going to say failover, but we have to incorporate all those different things, and yeah, maybe there's just like an ongoing planning of what we're actually going to do, and of course, really. At the end of all of this, so I'll move that actually going to take that out, don't like that. Oh, didn't mean to that. Too fast. And then once we've migrated it, we have to continuing optimize. And that's just kind of that, I'll put that as ongoing. So there's kind of the 4 phases we think about for the migration. So we have to discover what we have, assess, well, can it move? And if it can move, how should it move? Then perform the migration. And as part of this, again, as part of that planning, there'll be understanding the networking. What's the networking going to look like? And then the optimize. And what's really important as well is, remember there are different types of service. So for example, if I go databases, there's different database options. If it's a VDI environment, well, there's completely different solutions in the cloud to solve those things. And so I've got all of these kind of phases here. Well, what do we do with this? So the whole point is, when I think about all of this, really down to the migrate. The optimize is separate. This is Azure Migrate. And I think about Azure Migrate actually in different ways. I think of Azure Migrate, so I'll kind of underline that, it's the hub for all of your migration, because it can actually hook into different tooling. There's different tooling from partners, and it has its own native tooling. So we can kind of decide if the native tooling meets the requirements, fantastic, we're kind of done. If it doesn't, well then maybe I need to hook into something else. So Azure Migrate is a free service. I don't pay for Azure Migrate. I can go and stand up Azure Migrate in my subscription. I can use its tooling for free. but then maybe if I use third-party tooling, then I go and pay for that. And in terms of what Azure Migrate supports, and I'll actually show it in a second, but we can think about from Azure Migrate's perspective, it's the scenarios it wants to cover are, well, from on-premises. So from on-premises, it can support from VMware, Hyper-V, and bare metal. And technically, when I write bare metal, it could actually be from a different hypervisor. Because at this point, if we think about what it's going to do, for these, it's actually agentless. And agentless is a big deal. If I think about migrating production workloads, I don't want to mess with them. I don't want to have to install stuff. Many companies will be, I don't want to put stuff in my workload. So these are agentless. That actually works via the hypervisor, both for the discovery, even working out for VMware, even working out dependencies, and actually the migration itself. Now, in the past, it used Azure Site Recovery. And for Azure Site Recovery from VMware, it used a mobility service, which kind of sat inside the OS between the file system and the volume driver, would capture changes. It would send it to a configuration server and a provider I had on-prem, and then send it up into Azure. It doesn't do that for VMware here. For VMware, it's actually using snapshots, same with Hyper-V technology and replication. So it's not putting anything inside the OS instance. Now, for the bare metal, that is agent. So this is actually using the ASR APIs. So for this, yes, this has to be agent-based for the migration. The discovery can still be agentless. So that's from on-premises. And then also it can be from other cloud services. So I can actually think about when I have other clouds, and obviously things from AWS, the Google Cloud provider, it supports those. And it kind of goes without saying, for all of these, it's both Windows and Linux. Now that's its native tooling. Again, you make it into scenarios where I have Unix boxes, I have other things. So that's its tooling, is Windows and Linux. So if I think about tooling, that's what it is focused on. There are third-party sets of tooling that it links to and can integrate with for the discovery that support other types of discovery, Unix, for example. Now, there's one other thing. I drew this discovery, assess, migrate, optimize. And that's absolutely true. I would add one thing if we can, and that would be kind of at the top, spring clean. If I can avoid migrating a bunch of old data or old systems that I just don't need anymore, fantastic. So if before I start doing all of this stuff, if I can actually clean up my environment and get rid of stuff I know I don't need anymore, that's going to be great. So in terms of application services, data, if I have a bunch of old data, maybe it's in a database, maybe it's in file shares, whatever that is, if I can clean up first, it's going to make my life easier. Because obviously the migration, I have to move the bits over the wire, it takes time. If I can clean up first, let's do that. So think about using that first. So what I want to do now is we can actually jump over and just look around Azure Migrate. So I'm going to jump into more of a demo. So switch over. So here I'm actually looking at Azure Migrate. So again, you could just go and search for Azure Migrate, and this is what it's going to take you to. So the getting started, it's kind of talking about, well, there's different scenarios I'm going to cover. I think about moving Windows and Linux servers, moving database, or more scenarios. So if I go to explore more, it actually talks about, well, I can move web apps, which kind of relates to these areas we see on the side as well. I can move VDI to Windows Virtual Desktop. I can use DataBox. So DataBox would be for large-scale data migration offline using the various DataBox offerings. And it also then breaks down the different migration goals around servers, databases, VDI, web apps, and Databox. Now, the first thing you'll do is actually create a project. Now, if I just go to servers, you can see I'm already looking at my little project I created, excuse me. But if I hit change, it will actually go ahead and down here, it does let me go ahead and create a new one. And if I create a new one, what you'll see is you can pick the geography. So this is important when you think about data sovereignty. You can control where it's actually storing all of the data it's capturing that it's going to use as part of the migration. But we'll go back again. So if I think about servers, you'll see it saying, well, you have to add assessment tools, you have to add migration tools. And this is where you can see kind of very quickly, well, there's a whole bunch of different tooling. So there's the native Azure Migrate tooling, but then there's all of these third-party toolings. Now, the pricing would vary. You'd have to go and look at them. But it shows you, well, what do they support? So we can go through, we can hit learn more, but it tells you, well, agentless or agent-based. You can see here for the Azure Migrate, it's agentless discovery. So we focus up here. It doesn't require anything inside. Some of these, they offer both. So we have all these different options for the actual solutions. Likewise, in terms of doing the actual migration, we can see there's different migration tools as well, and it tells you what they support. Notice here, some of these support things like Unix. So there are different sets of tooling, but again, these may cost you money. The Azure Migrate ones, well, these are free. We also have solutions, for example, around databases. Now here, for the databases, for the VDI, for the web apps, Databox is really just linking to other tooling. So database migration, for example, for the tooling here, there's some third parties, but natively it has the database migration assistant. And what that does, actually, if I jump over quick, so here, I've installed this already, and I ran it against the database I have. And what it will actually show you is the feature parity. So are there features that are not going to work? So here I can see, well, there's some features that aren't going to work, and it tells me the command to make it work. Hey, I can run this kind of alter database, and then it would actually function okay. Also, I can see, well, what are the various compatibility issues I might face? And there aren't any. So 150 is all the way, I think that's SQL Server 2019. So I can see, well, I can actually run against any of kind of those key latest compact versions for Azure SQL Database, and I would be good to go. So I can feel pretty good about, oh, okay, from an assessment perspective, Azure Migrate is linking to the Database Migration Assistant, and I would actually be able to go and migrate that workload. I'll close that down. From a tooling, it uses the Azure-based Database Migration Server. So for the Azure Database Migration Server, there's a free and there's a paid for. So that really drives, can it do an online versus offline? If I quickly just open up the pricing page, here we can see for the Azure Database Migration Server, well, there's the standard SKUs, which are always free. Then there's the premium SKUs, which you pay for, but it is free for the first 6 months. So again, we can kind of see that. And the big difference here is when you get into the actual migration scenarios of the database. If we look at the scenario supported, what we can see is for offline, well, I can see, yep, SQL Server is supported, MI is supported from SQL Server. Notice it's also showing kind of the AWS, the RDS SQL, and Oracle as a source. So it's showing you what the targets could be and if it's supported offline. Remember, offline is the only possible with the free SKU. Then we get into continuous, but this is the premium SKU. Well, now it can support from RDS. And then if I go to things like using Postgres, well, it can support it from Oracle, RDS Postgres. So we get different scenarios for the online versus offline of the database. But remember, the online is that paid SKU, but even the paid SKU, you do get free for the first 6 months. So if your migration is going to be completed within 6 months, you're still good to go. If you get into VDI, well, VDI, they actually use a third party. So it's Lakeside. Lakeside will go and look at whatever your VDI environment is right now, and then essentially it's going to drive you to Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, if it's a pooled set of desktops, i.e. they're shared, then you're just going to create new images. Any user profile disks or roaming profiles will be converted to FS Logic, and there's tool sets for that. If they're personal desktops, then it's actually going to use the server migration technology to move those to Azure. For web apps is actually kind of this fun little tool. And it's tooling that if it's public facing, I can actually just run a site. So here I can go to appmigration.microsoft.com. And what I can do is I can just point it to a website. So if I point it to my saviltech.com, I can assess it. And it will actually show me if this would run in an app service plan. And basically it's saying you're good. You can start migrating it right now. It tells me all the technologies it's using. Now this is public facing. If it's not public facing, I can download a tool from this same site. You can see actually there's the download option. And here I can see all the scenarios. So it supports .NET, PHP, Java in preview. I can actually run the migration assistant on Linux as well in preview. It will work out, well, can it be migrated to an app service plan? And if it's using a database, it will give me the option. It can actually migrate the app database for me, or if the database is staying on premises, then it can use a hybrid connection to enable the app service to communicate to the database on premises. Databox is just really linking to using Databox. So it's just trying to bring the things together. So we really think of Azure Migrate as kind of that hub that has some of its own tooling. Now, what I want to focus on here is really around that kind of the server side. So if I jump back over, I'm actually going to switch to a different environment now. So this is Microsoft's demo environment, and obviously they have much better stuff than I have ready to go. So the first thing is, well, the actual server discovery. So the first thing you have to do is actually discover. You can see it's driving here through those steps. It's saying, hey, you need to go and discover first. Now you can go to the overview, and the overview again will kind of walk through, hey, these are the steps you need to perform to actually get this. You can see, hey, you need to assess servers first, then you can think about replicating, and it's showing me the state of all of my current information. But I'm going to jump back and just do discover. Now the first thing is, well, how are we discovering? How are your machines currently hosted? So here you'll notice I can say, well, it's VMware, Hyper-V, or physical, or other. So that's where it's like, well, it's AWS, it's Google Cloud, it's Zen as a hypervisor. Now if it's VMware, what it's actually going to do is get you to download this open virtual appliance OVA file, and you'll deploy that to a VMware VM. Through that VMware VM, it will now go and talk to vCenter. So I have to give it credentials for vCenter. It will go and discover all the VMs. It will then go and get the configuration. It can do that agentless, actually dependency mapping and that performance gathering. If it's Hyper-V, well, then it's going to give me a VHD file that it's going to download. And I would run that on my Hyper-V server, and it would do exactly the same thing. It doesn't do agentless discovery, though. I have to use an agent for discovery on Hyper-V. And if it's none of those, then it's just going to download me a package that I will install myself on a Windows server that will then act as that discovery appliance. So it's going to go and get me all of the various information I need. So I'm deploying essentially this appliance into my environment. No agent required for the discovery on the systems I want to migrate, which is important. Production, I don't want to mess with my environments. I don't want to install stuff on them. Now, each of these Azure Migrate projects supports up to 35,000 VMs, and each of these individual discovery appliances support up to 10,000 VMs. So it may be I require multiple appliances. Now, once I've deployed these, within about 15 minutes, I'll get data coming in. So we can see here it's actually started to discover servers, and it will align them with the actual appliance you use. So I can see there's multiple appliances here. So we've got demo appliance 1, and we can see it started to get information. It's giving us information about the applications installed on them and kind of gives us that detail. It's giving us detail about the configuration. I can even do things like view the dependencies. So this is based on what it was talking to. These are the things that I might need to consider kind of moving together. What it's going to use as part of its maybe guidance around, well, grouping the things together. Now it's saying 0 just because of the time range. If we change the time range, just going to go and look back, what is it talking to for a longer period of time, then we'll actually see, okay, well, it's these things it's working with. These are the things we should consider. It's going to show us things talking to it. So I can see the various clients talking to it. And it will then also show me the servers it's talking to. So depending on the port, it helps me understand what is the actual type of service and the interaction it's actually doing on there. Now, again, this is all port and network based. If I was using something like application insights, that actually uses mapping based on the functions that's being called through the .NET or the J2E, whatever that might be. But essentially now we've discovered information about all of the various servers. Once we have that, well, the next step, remember, was to kind of do the assessment. And it guides us through that. It's saying, well, now you should create an assessment. Now, as part of creating an assessment, I can specify, well, what I want it to actually base that assessment on. So if I hit view all, I can modify all the different attributes of the assessment. So firstly, I can say, well, I want it to pick the type of storage based on that performance gathering it did. Am I using reserved instances? Obviously, I get savings based on that. What is my sizing criteria? Performance-based is going to right size. Or I can say, just copy what's on premises. How much performance history do I want to look at? What is the percentage utilization I care about? So this is the 95th percentile. How comfortable do I want to be? So I can pad it if I want to pad. It's like, I'm not sure it captured the big peaks. Let's increase it a little bit so I've got some wiggle room. What VM sizes do I want to support? And then there's other options here about sort of pay as you go, the currency, etc. And I can pick kind of that target location. If I actually change that to West US, you might see different kind of things pop up. And kind of there we go. Now notice my assessment type here is Azure VMs. If I hit the drop down, I can actually specify Azure VMware solution. So if I'm a VMware shop today and I've decided that, I think I'm in a rush, I don't have time to go to Azure native, I don't have time to reskill, so I can use the Azure APIs, I just want to use vCenter, then you can also do an assessment based on going to VMware. So you're going to run these assessments based on that discovered data. Now, once you've done that, firstly, you can create groups. So I can group servers together based on those dependencies. And I can look at my actual assessments. So the assessments will actually now show me, well, what does it recommend? Is it ready to go to the cloud? What's that confidence rating? Confidence rating is based on how long did it look at the data. So I can look at one of these assessments. And here it's saying, well, it's ready for Azure. I can actually look at the details around the readiness. So for each of those, it will kind of show me the details. And it can support UEFI as well. It's not just the old style BIOS. So here I can see the actual VM size it's going to recommend. And I can change that. So when I actually go through and do the actual replication, I can change what I want that final size to be. It's showing me what it thinks the cost's going to be, what it saw, and what kind of drove it to pick that size. So it really gives me full insight into everything it was doing to work out, well, this is my assessment, this is kind of my recommendations for these different types of workloads we actually have. Now, once we've done the assessment, we feel pretty good. We know what we have. We know what we're going to use. Now, if it's a server migration, so this is kind of just that rehosting scenario and not refactoring or doing anything else, then the next thing would obviously be to replicate. So here we can actually go in and say, hey, where are we replicating from? Now again, if it's VMware or Hyper-V, it's agentless. It's using the hypervisor, it's using snapshot and replication of those snapshots. If it's not Hyper-V or VMware, then it is agent-based. The agent base installs the mobility service inside the OS, both Windows and Linux. It's going to sit between the file system and the volume driver to capture those changes, send them to a process server. So we have to have a second appliance. It's a replication appliance now. There's the config server and the process server. And that will then send that up to this hidden master target in Azure that will write it to disks, get it all ready for it. So I have to pick what I'm doing. Again, if it was this kind of physical, then we're going to have this replication appliance that it's going to set up for us. But no matter what I do, I'm still picking the appliance that it's using to actually go and get those snapshots. And then I can go through and drive through all the different virtual machines. These are all disconnected, I think, right now. But then I would go through, pick the VMs, pick the target services. So this is where I could change the target settings to be a different VM size if I didn't want it, and control that. Now, notice it does break it down into that kind of main page. We have the migration tools. So I can see where there are servers replicating right now. So once that's set up, once they're replicating through the Azure Migrate appliance, we can, if I click the little three dots, normally we'd be able to do a test migration, but it's offline right now. But you can see there's a test migrate, so you'd always do that first. And then I would do the actual migrate option. Now, as part of the final migrate, we can say, well, let's shut it down. So we get a clean final replication of the data. And then once that's done, we would leave it shut down on-prem and we would start it up in Azure. So you can see those various different options to actually complete the whole process. So Azure Migrate here is really guiding you through everything you need to do. I can think about, yep, it's here we're focusing on the migration, so we can see the replication state, test the migration. It's going to warn you if you've not done a test, and then actually perform that final cutover. So we think about, we do a discovery, we do an assessment, we set up the replication, and then we do the migration. We do not have to rediscover. This is here, this discovery option under migrate is if you decided to just skip the whole server assessment portion at the top and went straight into migration. But if I've already done that assessment up here, so I did a discovery, an assessment, then I can go replicate, migrate. So it's going to kind of run all of that for me. Remember, it does also link to those other solutions. That third-party tooling will bring the data into Azure Migrate. There is the Azure Database Migration Service as well, which again will facilitate that offline and online move. So there we have it. That was kind of a bit of a whirlwind tour around migration. The documentation is phenomenal. So I really recommend kind of walking through the documentation. Azure Migrate is that hub that's going to help you really understand and go through the process. We're going to go and do that discovery, run the assessments, set up the replication, and then do a test failover or migration, then do the final migration. But don't just jump to VMs. Really think about, well, what are all the different target services in Azure? Think about answering those questions for each application. You're going to end up putting them in buckets. The rehost bucket, refactor bucket, re-architect bucket, rebuild bucket, replace bucket. Work out the planning, work out the timing, your budgets. And then, yes, Azure Migrate has a fantastic set of tooling. The agent list for Hyper-V and VMware is awesome. I don't want to mess with the inside of my OS if I can avoid it. But if I have other types of workload, I mean, it links and it has the partner solutions. It has other Azure services like the database migration service. But even things like VDI, there are partner solutions for discovery. There's tooling to help convert things like user profile disks and roaming profiles to those FS logic containers for that profile and data. So take some time, go through it. But that's how we think about migration. It's a lot of planning, it's a lot of discovery, but then hopefully that will give you kind of the best outcome for that final migration. These projects are not to be taken lightly. There's a lot of work involved, a lot of planning, but I think if you kind of go through it steadily and really plan it out, you can be successful. I hope this was useful. Until next time, take care.